what is, I think, perhaps slightly misleadingly, but not fully misleadingly described as far-right politics, parties like the AfD or the RN or Giorgia Meloni's government in Italy, which has not been boycotted, by the way, the Brothers of Italy party, which is a post-fascist party again, they've now become part of normalised European politics. And they have to become it because they represent a significant and substantial part of the European electorate. And so these kind of like foot stamping tantrum like demands from people that they should be completely boycotted, they're completely unrealistic. You can't avoid the views of 30 to 40% of voters, or at least 20% of voters in many European states. No matter how much you might want to, it's a political reality you have to deal with.
Hello and welcome to Reasoned UK with me, Darren Grimes. If you enjoy today's content, please do consider actually hitting that little notification bell and the like button to make sure that you don't miss out on any future content. Today's guest has quite a fascinating theory. For his latest column in the Daily Telegraph, he reminds us that it used to be the case that the left were against the EU and the right, like Mrs. Thatcher, very much in favour of the single market. And then, of course, that reversed and the right became sceptical of the removed and remote bureaucracy, and the left viewed the EU as a guardian, a vanguard of social liberalism and market intervention, whereas the right viewed it with deep scepticism of ever-growing and ever-closer union. So could this change again? Could we actually end up in a scenario in which the left argues in favour of keeping us out of the EU, whilst the right seeks to rejoin it? Now, it might seem pretty implausible now, but it's a political switch that Dr. Steve Davies, head of education at the Institute of Economic Affairs, a London-based think tank, can actually see happening. And I'm delighted to say Steve joins me now to discuss his theory. Steve, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Darren. Good to be with you.
Now, Steve, before we actually get into your piece, can you first of all tell us how the attitude towards Brexit currently is actually a clear indicator of where someone will sit politically?
Yes, it's not a perfect indicator, but it does work pretty well. Generally speaking, if you think that Brexit was a good thing, and you still support Brexit, even though you might be disappointed about some of the details of how it's worked out, then that means normally that you're on the right. Usually, not always though, the free market right. There are a number of people like, say, Mick Lynch, who support Brexit on socialist grounds, but they're a smaller group. Then, on the other hand, if you deeply regret Brexit, you were a Remainer during the campaign, and you tend to think that the EU stands for a set of liberal values, such as cosmopolitanism, supranational governance, and so on, then you will typically be on the liberal left. So that's how it roughly acts as an indicator or marker of political allegiance at the moment.
Yeah, and I mean, the likes of the Lynches of the world, I can't really see them, or even the Jeremy Corbyns, dare I say, right? Because in the 2016 referendum, Steve, as you well know, Jeremy Corbyn just sort of shrugged his shoulders and didn't really do anything because his heart clearly wasn't in a Remain victory. Now, will the likes of Corbyn, the Lynches, what I would call the old left, will people like that suddenly think, oh, wow, well, suddenly the EU looks like the best thing since sliced bread?
No, I don't think so. I think those people have always been opposed to the EU. As you mentioned, Jeremy Corbyn, for example, ran in an explicitly anti-EEC, as it then was, manifesto in '83. I think he may well even have voted leave in the privacy of the voting booth. Who knows? But I strongly suspect that. I think people like Mick Lynch they've always been against the EU. They are going to remain against the EU because they basically believe in socialism carried out by an independent British state. And so they're against the EU or any future European project, both on the grounds that it's broadly neoliberal, as they would say, managerial capitalism, roughly, and on the grounds that it violates national independence. So I don't think they're going to change their views. The people I think who are going to change their views are what you might call the soft liberal centre-left, the Guardian, the current leadership of the Labour Party, the broad swathe of kind of centre-left opinion which takes its views from the BBC, the Guardian, and a number of other outlets like that.
Is there an element to which being in power, Steve, would actually push Labour in the opposite direction, as in, you've got suddenly Labour is in control. They might have a commanding majority, who knows, and actually suddenly it thinks, well, we don't need them.
Well, my view is that the left is there are three parts really to my prediction in that column in the Telegraph and the Twitter thread I did earlier. The first one is that the left is going to fall out of love with the EU, and I think that's going to happen in the next 10 years. And the reason is, I think that at the moment, the liberal left's relationship with the EU is a bit like one of those marriages where one of the parties is in love not with the real person they're married to, but with a kind of fantasy version of that person. And they project a kind of image onto the person they're married to that doesn't match the reality. And as a result, they're blind to their partner's faults. They ignore infidelities and bad behavior and all that kind of thing. And then all of a sudden, something happens and it just dawns on them that they're not married to the person they thought they were. And then typically, as we can probably tell from personal experiences of people we know, that leads to a spectacular bust up and a loss of love. Well, I think something like that is going to happen with the liberal left in the EU. They currently project their own values onto the EU, and they think that the EU is a political entity that is, for example, broadly pro-migration, anti-aggressive nationalism, opposed to harsh lines on immigration, in favour of a kind of global cosmopolitan worldview. Now, that is not the reality. The reality of European politics is that in country after country, the tendency is towards populist right-wing nationalism. And if you look at, say, for example, immigration policy, people complain here about the policy and rhetoric of Suella Braverman, the Home Secretary, and the government, all this stuff about small boats. But if you look at the kind of legislation being passed in Denmark, in Italy, in France, in Spain, it's way more stringent and hostile to migrants and immigrants than anything that anybody has proposed recently in the UK. And this tendency is going to continue. And sooner or later, I think there is going to be a symbolic event, an event that nobody can ignore. Maybe the Ralliement National wins the national election in France, for example, or the AfD joins a coalition government in Germany. And at that point, I think a lot of the liberal left in Britain are going to realise that the political direction that Europe is going in is one that is completely the opposite of the political values and beliefs that they hold. And at that point, I think they're going to suddenly think, wait a minute, we don't want to be a part of this. This is not the way we want to be. And they will no longer be able to see the EU as being the kind of promised land or upholder of their own political values and beliefs. In other words, they'll be a bit like somebody who is married to a partner and is in love not with the reality of that partner or the changing reality of that partner, but a kind of fantasized, projected version of what that person is like. And when, as I know from experience with people I know, when you suddenly wake up to the reality that the person you're married to is not the person you thought you were, suddenly things end spectacularly. And I think that's what will happen with the liberal left. And so what I'm pretty confident about is the prediction that within about 10 years, the liberal left will have massively fallen out of love with the European project in the EU because they will not like the direction that it's taken.
I want to get on to explore a bit more of that in the sense of, the right now, Steve, would be saying, Brexit was a project to ensure that there was accountability to the British voter, that actually Parliament was supreme, that, all those watchwords of sovereignty, national sovereignty, and a lot of scepticism around, even during the pandemic. We've had conversations in the past about the World Health Organization, for example. There's a lot of scepticism now around these global outfits and institutions. Why do you think the right will suddenly say, oh, well, hang on a minute, despite the fact the EU is this blob that I once rallied against, I can see that its values very much align with mine.
Yeah. So the more controversial part of my prediction is I think that the right is going to change its views and that the British right, or at least a very large part of it, maybe not all of it, will become much more sympathetic to the idea of a European project, if you will. And I think there's two reasons for that. One is that I think what nations discover is that although the idea of having democratic accountability and control over the choices that you make as a political community over policy is very attractive. And I share that view. That's very much my view as well. The problem is that for a medium-sized country in today's world, many of the issues that you face are very difficult for a medium-sized country to deal with on its own. It's actually easier to deal with if you're a small country or a very big one. If you're in that kind of awkward intermediate size, it becomes very difficult. Can you deal with the problems and challenges of global migration, for example, if you're just one country? Very, very difficult when you think about the scale of the phenomenon you're confronted with. Can you pursue an independent financial, monetary and fiscal policy if you're in a world of floating currencies and unrestricted capital movement? As we saw with Liz Truss, actually very, very difficult. And therefore, I think some of the people on the right are going to think, well, okay, if we want to achieve the political goals we have, we might well need to do this in some form of closer cooperation with Europe. Now, that may not happen. I mean, I am prepared to say that that's a prediction about which I'm less confident. It may well be that actually the left changes its views, but the right, in Britain anyway, broadly does not. The other aspect of this way of thinking, though, is that I think the nature of the British right may well change in the next few years. Right now, the British Brexit right is a combination of emphasis upon national autonomy, national independence, and all the things you're talking about, plus, broadly speaking, free markets. That tends to be the way the combination goes. Now, I think if you look at that National Conservatism conference we had in London a couple of weeks ago, which you spoke at, I noticed, then what were represented at that conference was certainly that political combination, but also, particularly among some of the younger delegates there, a quite different kind of right-wing politics and conservatism. What is sometimes described as post-liberalism, which is a kind of conservatism where the whole economic issue is downplayed dramatically. And to the extent that there is an economic aspect to it, it's not actually very free market. And conservatives of that kind are more concerned with, as they see, conserving and defending and perhaps redeveloping a kind of classical Western civilization against the threat of a kind of homogenizing globalism, which they identify as much with global capitalism as they do with anything like the EU. Now, I think a lot of right wingers of that kind are going to increasingly think that the things they don't like about contemporary politics come mainly from the United States and the US academy, the US university system, the US media. And the politicians that they like, who they see as articulating the views that they want to see put forward in Britain, are people like Viktor Orban, maybe Kaczynski and the PIS in Poland, maybe Marine Le Pen or her niece Marion Maréchal in France. And they're going to feel a closer affinity, perhaps, with that kind of continental European right than they are with the more kind of globalist free market Anglo-Saxon right. So I think there's going to be a bit of a tussle in Britain in the next decade between different visions of what conservative politics are. And I think you'll be on one side of that tussle, I think it's fair to say. Other people will be on the other side. And it's a question of which one comes out on top. Now, I don't know about that really. I mean, I just think that there's a pretty good chance that it's a more sort of continentally oriented type of conservatism that will come out on top in Britain, or indeed the British right may split. I mean, that's another quite likely possibility.
Well, exactly.
I think you will find it.
I mean, on that point of actually splitting, the question that I would have, Steve, would be, where are we at right now? Because right now, the 2019 coalition that was built, you know, the Tory shires, I guess, your stereotypical Tory shire, with your Brexit back and so-called Red Wall area. Now, you've been speaking about the realignment for, I don't wish to make you feel old, Steve, but for a wee while now. Now, that seems to be falling apart, that coalition.
Yeah.
So is this a realignment that never was?
No, I think the realignment is still very much out there. What has happened is that the Conservative Party in 2019 had managed to hit a sweet spot. They put together they had three parts to that coalition. You had the Tory shires, you had a largely working class vote up in the north of England and the Midlands, the Red Wall, from your part of the world, basically. Mm-hmm. But you also had a significant number of metropolitan free market liberals who didn't like Boris Johnson but stuck with the Tories because Jeremy Corbyn, basically.
Yes.
No way they're going to vote for Jeremy Corbyn. Now, what has happened since then, it's been partly complicated by the pandemic, but what has happened since then is that in order to hold that coalition together, the Conservative leadership, Boris Johnson and later, had to decide to either stick with the red wall, which would have meant moving significantly to the left on economics, and that I think is what Boris Johnson was looking to do with all this levelling up stuff, which would have meant gradually writing off a lot of the largely southern metropolitan, like middle class free market liberal vote, or they should have stuck with the free market side, but that would have accepted that they were going to have a hard time holding on to the red wall. Mm-hmm. And in the end, they sort of broadly went the second route, but made a complete balls up of it for various personal reasons. And the consequence is that the whole coalition has fallen apart. They're now in the position where they're going to lose 2/3 of that coalition, because the red wall is probably going to go back to Labour, and the free market liberals down the south are probably going to vote for the Liberal Democrats. And so they're going to end up losing both the blue wall and the red wall. It's a monumental piece of political incompetence, quite frankly. But I think the realignment amongst voters is still there. Now, the challenge then is for the Labour Party. And I think Keir Starmer is sending out quite interesting little signals that he's looking to keep hold of those socially conservative and fairly patriotic red wall northern voters. His thinking, I suspect, is that this will infuriate the kind of younger left voters who might be tempted to vote for the Greens, but he can afford to lose them because they're not a serious electoral threat to him. So I think the Labour Party is now looking to put together a similar kind of coalition built around those kind of patriotic, socially quite traditionalist voters, blue Labour as they're often called, in places like the Midlands and the north of England. But it's a difficult trick for either party. In our political system, with first past the post, it's always quite tricky, because it's not like the continent where you would have 6 parties in Britain if we had a PR system, and you can then make deals to form a government. You have to actually make those deals at the stage of drawing up your electoral manifesto and your party pitch, which means it happens behind closed doors, and it's a lot more tricky in many ways. So I think the Tories have made a total mess of it, but I think the Labour Party is going to have big challenges once it gets into government.
Yeah, I mean, do you see a route to Britain becoming a PR electoral system nation? Because if, for example, the Labour Party managed to secure a majority, but it's not an outright majority, they don't have enough numbers to govern on their own, do the Lib Dems say, well, I ain't fallen for the same trick twice, I'm not going to get into coalition, but what I will say is I'll give you my votes if you give us electoral reform?
Well, yeah, that's the only scenario in which it could happen, because clearly if you can win an election under the existing system, why do you need PR? So if the Labour Party wins a majority, which it looks as though it will do right now, mainly because of the implosion of the SNP in Scotland, then why on earth does Keir Starmer want to, tie his hands by introducing PR? He won't. He'd sooner stick pins in his eyes than do that. And this is true for most Labour MPs. The thing that they really, really, really don't want to do is to have to make deals with the Liberals. They'd sooner do all kinds of terrible things than that. If, on the other hand, there's a hung parliament and a second election also results in a hung parliament, that's the other kind of thing that would have to happen, then the Liberals and other parties might be able to insist on PR without a referendum as a condition for supply and confidence voting, for example. But I think that's a low probability. I think the chances that we will adopt PR absent a major political upheaval are actually quite low, because the people who dominate under the existing system do not have any incentive to do it, and they're the only ones who are typically going to be in a position to do it. So it's a low probability. I would say it's about a 20% probability myself at most.
And then what is the probability then of, because I mean, if this does happen, I imagine Rishi Sunak, the writing is on the wall for him, in that Nigel Farage is saying, look, I might join forces with Boris Johnson, for example. I mean, I think that happening is pretty slim. Knowing both men, I can't actually see them. I think there ain't a party big enough for the two of them,
Yeah, precisely. I think that would be a case of mixing together two chemical substances that spontaneously combust when brought into contact. No, I don't see that happening. I do think, though, that there will be, particularly if it's a bad defeat, I think there will be some serious, and quite correctly, some serious debate about what the nature of the party is, what the nature of the right more broadly is, what direction it ought to go in going forward. And I think that that's the point at which it will become clear that there are several quite different visions. There's what you might call Enoch Powell style national liberalism, which is a combination, as I say, of free markets plus national sovereignty and conventional British patriotism. But there's also a more kind of Burkean conservatism, and more importantly, there's this kind of post-liberal conservatism that we can see developing in the United States, but which I think actually has more going for it over here in Europe. And so I do expect there to be quite an intense debate. Now, how that plays out in terms of party politics, who knows? That's as much to do with personalities, as you indicated just now, as it is to do with ideas. But I do think we're going to see a big, big debate in the British right in the next 5 to 6 years over exactly what it is they stand for, and more importantly, what kind of project it is they want to follow. Because let's say you are a person who's broadly on the right, you do not like the intellectual and cultural trends in contemporary Britain, you don't like various aspects of the way British institutions work these days. What is the project you want to follow? Do you want to create a small but strong state and a largely free market economy, or do you think perhaps that you need a more active state in order to maintain the kind of arguments Miriam Cates has been making, for example, that you need an active state to promote family life, that kind of case. And I think those kind of arguments are going to really occupy the Conservative Party and the right more generally quite a lot in the next 10 years. And you're going to see the kind of post-Thatcher free market conservatism not exactly attacked, but a lot of people are going to be putting forward ideas for a quite different project for conservatism, one that's more about social reconstruction, social renewal, if you will, and institutional reform of the institutions of the British state, which I think everyone can agree now, regardless of their politics, are in pretty bad shape and do need reform. And so it's going to be very interesting, but it will lead to, I think, and this is my argument, which is, Lord Frost, David Frost, disagreed with me respectfully. This is why I think the British, some parts anyway, the British right are going to start thinking a bit differently about European project. The third part of my prediction, by the way, is that I think something interesting is going to happen in the politics of the EU in the next 15 years or 10 years, because Emmanuel Macron and the European centrists and the people at the sort of apparatchiks, if you like, of the EU bureaucracy, they know perfectly well that the EU will not survive another major euro crisis, and that in order to keep the euro stable, they need to have fiscal union. They need to have much closer integration. The problem they have, the challenge they face, is that to get that past the nationalist parties, the RN, Viktor Orban, the Vox party in Spain and others, they need to be able to make it acceptable to these strongly nationalist populist parties. Now, you might think, well, that's an impossibility. And if that's the case, I think actually the long-term, medium-term outlook for the EU is very bleak. I really do think it might not survive. But there is a way they could do it, and that is to say, well, the big problem with Europe, historically, as a political project, is there is no European demos. People do not think of themselves as Europeans. They think of themselves as French, German, Italians. What you would need to create, if Emmanuel Macron is to get his vision, is a European identity. And how do you do that? Well, the obvious thing is to create a kind of sense of a European identity, a pan-European identity, that's defined against other parts of the world. So not African, not Middle Eastern, not Russian, not American. And I think that would be the kind of vision of European identity that the populist parties might buy into. For their part, that, as I said earlier on, they're going to find that they cannot really pursue the national policies they want to pursue on their own, because the world that we're in is one where it's very, very difficult for France on its own or Poland on its own to pursue a truly national policy, particularly one that looks to preserve their national cultures from the overwhelming cultural power of the United States and American popular culture. And so I think they are also going to, as you can see with Giorgia Meloni right now, they're going to make their peace with the EU. So I think that we're going to see a kind of rapprochement European politics. And that's one of the reasons I think why, going back to my original prediction, the British left is going to then fall out of love with the EU, because the project that will emerge out of European politics, I think, is one that they will, for good reasons in my view, not be at all comfortable with. And they'll start to think, well, really, we'd rather orient ourselves more towards America, which we have more common values with.
And what happens then, Steve? How much does the electoral politics in America actually impact this theory? Because, if Ron DeSantis, for example, it's not looking likely, but were he to be the nominee and were he to win against President Biden, who, isn't exactly looking strong and stable in the words of Theresa May, what on earth happens then? Because surely the kind of figures on the populist right that you're talking about would look at Ron DeSantis in America and think, we've got to align ourselves with this man. He's our man. He
Ah,
speaks our language.
that's a key question. I actually don't think so, because one of the things at the moment is a lot of this emergent right, these sort of new, younger right thinkers in Britain, they tend to be presented as being like American Republicans. This kind of right of Trump, DeSantis, J.D. Vance, Josh Hawley, people like that in the
Yeah.
United States. Actually, I don't think they are, because to quote the title of a recent book, this is not the US. Britain and the US are very, very different countries. And one of the annoying features of both left and right media in the UK at the moment is the way they tend to think that we're just like the United States, and we're not. We're very, very different in all sorts of ways. To take just one example, we've never had institutionalized segregation like Jim Crow. So race relations in the UK are completely different to American ones. We don't have the kind of historical legacy. We have a different historical legacy that we need to deal with. Now, I think that actually
Which you wouldn't know,
conservative.
Steve, if you read The
No,
Guardian.
you wouldn't know.
But
No, you would not realise it. You would not realise this from looking at the media. It's, I mean, go a bit off track here, but this is something that really annoys me. I mean, we learn all the time about Rosa Parks and so on. Nobody ever talks about the Bristol bus strike.
Yes.
If you want to talk about resistance to racial prejudice, why not talk about the Bristol bus strike, which is a British event, a very moving event, by the way, but nobody knows about it. We learn about American history instead. Anyway, that's another story. The thing is that I think British conservatives who try to imitate conservative American politics are basically on a losing ticket. They're not going to find that that plays well in the UK. They'll need to find a voice and a kind of rhetoric and approach which plays better with the British public. Now, having said that, suppose that what I think is happening with the predominant, what you might call mainstream centre-left opinion in Britain, and a lot of centre-right opinion as well, is that they identify with one half of American politics. They're very happy with the Democrats being in power in DC. They identify broadly with the kind of mainstream Democrat opinion that Joe Biden represents. They're deeply disturbed by the kind of direction the Republican Party has been taking. And so that looks like becoming the predominant party in American politics. Yes, that does throw the whole of this up in the air, because people might think even if they don't like the direction European politics is going in, they certainly don't want to be identified with Ron DeSantis or the Republicans. On the other hand, if it looks as though the Democrats are becoming the more predominant party in American politics, then that will not be the case, I think. I think that the kind of what you might call respectable opinion in the UK will still tend to look to America for its ideas and for models of what to do. It's worth saying, by the way, that that's entirely up in the air. I don't know enough about American politics, and it's very uncertain how that will go. My own opinion, for what it's worth, is that the Republicans at the moment have a huge handicap, which is their support for the Dobbs decision and very strong anti-abortion positions, because that is costing them the support of a critical demographic, which is suburban, college-educated white women,
yeah.
who are very, very hostile to strict abortion controls. And that particular demographic is crucial to winning the major swing states in the Electoral College, because they tend to be concentrated in large suburban counties around major metropolitan areas. So I think that's an enormous self-inflicted electoral wound for the Republicans, which is why I think that although Donald Trump may well win the nomination, I would only give him about a 40% chance of winning the general because of that.
I mean, interestingly, Steve, I was actually struck by the way in which we had a conversation about the abortion debate in Britain, because, most recently when a woman who obtained pills abortion pills, I guess is what you would call them in a not too elegant way, during lockdown. And of course, the nation then, well, I say the nation, one is a bit of a fool if you mistake the conversations on Twitter for the conversations of the nation. But, even my mother, who certainly is not a tweeter, Steve, she was saying, this is outrageous, and she wanted to have the conversation about abortion and that whether or not our term limits are too liberal. So, I mean, that conversation happened here. So is there not a way in which actually it's sort of true that the debates that happen in America are happening over here too? Not to the same extent, but they happen,
Yes, they are. But the point is, and this is where I think the Americans have made a complete mess of things. In every other European country, you have pretty intense debates. I mean, this is an issue where people on both sides feel very strongly and have principled reasons for the views they take. And I think what has happened, though, in European country after European country, is that a kind of modus vivendi has been arrived at. Now, there will still be recurring hard cases which lead people to question whether or not that modus vivendi is viable. So basically, the kind of position most countries have is that you have pretty free abortion in the first 3 months, restricted in the second 3 months, virtually nothing at all in the last 3 months, except for very exceptional cases. That's broadly what the public can live with. But then hard cases come up like that one, and people say, well, maybe we should move the boundaries backwards or forwards. But the point is that there's a conversation, there's a mechanism for that conversation to take place through political debate, arguments in Parliament, political elections. In the United States, very foolishly, they chose to do it all through constitutional law. And the nature of constitutional law is it's either up or down. It's either one thing or the other. And so you've had this incredibly polarized debate, that working out over years and years of political debate of what it was that the public could bear, even if the people on either side ultimately weren't fully 100% with it. That never took place in the United States. They're only just starting to have that argument now. And it's probably going to take them, on historical precedent, about 20 years to roughly work out where they are. The genius, of course, of the American system is the federalism, which means that each state can work out where it stands on this. But because they've got into the mindset of dealing with this, and I have to say some other issues, through constitutional law rather than through the cut and thrust of politics, means that they're in a bad place in terms of having an argument about it. So I don't think that kind of highly polarized American argument is going to translate across here into Britain, or for that matter Ireland or anywhere else in Europe, because although there are still people here who have strongly held views, pro or anti, like your mum, as you discovered, somebody you wouldn't be expected to have these kind of views, those views are expressed through a different mechanism than they are in the United States. And the mechanism we have for expressing them doesn't lead to the kind of stark A or B polarization that you find in the United States. I mean, Ireland being a great example of that, where they've had actually a constitutional amendment, never mind anything else, and it was all done with strong minority strongly dissenting, but there was still a broad consensus behind it. So yes, we are going to have a debate, but it's not going to be a debate of the same kind that the Americans are having.
Mm-hmm. If say, for example, and you touched on this, but if the alternative for Deutschland, the AfD, win power to a significant degree in the end to government in Germany, what then happens? Does the EU automatically say, because this would be how I would see it going, Steve, but tell me if you disagree, that actually the EU would then coalesce to ostracize. Obviously, you can't properly ostracize Germany because it's the biggest economy in the bloc, but it all of a sudden wouldn't have as much say in European Union affairs as it did under Angela Merkel, for example. Would they? You don't think that would happen?
No. I can remember when in Austria, the OFP, the Austrian Freedom Party, which is a kind of fascist light party, to be polite about it, when it joined a coalition government, this was about 10, 12 years ago, exactly what you described happened. Austria was ostracized, wasn't allowed to attend meetings, was cut out of the loop. The point is that the success of populist right parties in Europe is now so widespread that they can't do this cordon sanitaire anymore. In Spain, for example, the Prime Minister has called a snap election for this summer. It's pretty certain that the right is going to win that election in Spain, but the People's Party, the PP, is not going to have a majority. It's going to have to depend upon Vox, the populist right, far right party, to get a majority. Is Spain going to be cut out? I would bet serious money against it. Similarly, if the AfD at the next election in Germany is part of a coalition with the CDU, CSU, which I think it probably will be, I would probably put money on that as well. I really do not think the EU would boycott them. I think that boat has sailed. You could do that when it was just those crazy Austrians, basically, or those eccentric and romantic Hungarians, perhaps. But you can't do it when it's a major state or when it's happening in one state after another. And so I think that basically that boat has sailed. I think that basically what is, I think, perhaps slightly misleadingly, but not fully misleadingly described as far-right politics, parties like the AfD or the RN or Giorgia Meloni's government in Italy, which has not been boycotted, by the way, the Brothers of Italy party, which is a post-fascist party again, they've now become part of normalised European politics. And they have to become it because they represent a significant and substantial part of the European electorate. And so these kind of like foot stamping tantrum like demands from people that they should be completely boycotted, they're completely unrealistic. You can't avoid the views of 30 to 40% of voters, or at least 20% of voters in many European states. No matter how much you might want to, it's a political reality you have to deal with. And so, no, I don't think the EU is going to do that.
And just finally, then, Steve, I mean, in the short term, where do you see? Because right now there's this idea. David Lammy, who is I believe he's Shadow Justice Secretary for the Labour Party, he said that actually the Labour Party's first priority, as far as the economy is concerned, in government would be to align closer to the European Union. Now, how does that end up looking? Do you think, Steve, that actually will end up in some kind of associate membership where, we've left the EU, but I mean, in my view, Steve, that would mean why did we bother in the first bloody place?
Well, yeah, I do think it's quite likely we will end up in what would have been like a Norway position. In other words, we will be in the single market, but we'll not be in the common tariff, basically. We'll be outside the common tariff zone, but we will be in the single market regulatory regime. This all goes back to the original decision to leave the EU. With hindsight, although many people said this at the time, the big problem was that the people who wanted to leave hadn't got a clear idea about what they wanted to do next. And what several people advocated was that we should adopt that position, being in the single market but exiting the external tariff area, the customs union, for a 10, 15-year transitional period, because that would enable you to adjust the British economy to the shock of leaving the single market and all of the regulatory standards that people were used to. That probably is what we're actually going to go back to. I think we are going to enter into an agreement like that, but it will probably be on a kind of rather ad hoc temporary basis. And I don't think that there will be any moves towards closer political affiliation with Europe. I think the Labour Party has already decided that that is a box they just do not want to open for all sorts of reasons, not least those red wall voters. But also, increasingly, they're for the kind of reasons I spoke about, they're already beginning to think that maybe they're not that keen about it. But I do think there will be strong pressure, not least from British industry, that we go back into the single market. And we can already see signs of this. So, Kemi Badenoch has already said that we're not going to get rid of all of the EU regulations. We're going to get rid of, I think, some very small number, if I remember rightly. And she said, she's not an arsonist. Because the point is, and that's why I think Norway for now would have been a good way of dealing with exiting, because to be serious, it's a huge amount of regulations and they're very complex, and unpicking them all is a job for about a decade's worth of hard work. And so the question is not so much, do we rejoin the single market? I think that makes sense. The question is, what do we do once we've done that? Do we just sit back and sigh and say, that was a terrible experience, so we're now back with a regulatory regime, which would be really bad because we'd be in a regulatory regime where we had no say in what the regulations are, which is the worst of both worlds in many ways. Or do we say, well, okay, we're back in this regulatory regime now. Now we can start on a much longer term project of thinking about, well, okay, we're fine with these regulations here, but here in this other area, we might want to unpick them and and then negotiate with the EU a separation in that sector. And that could be spread out for quite a long period. Now, I think what will drive that kind of, I suspect we will actually do the second, and what will drive it is very contingent specific cases. Maybe the Labour Party or whoever's in power wants to do something about the state of British agriculture, and they think, well, okay, we've never been in the CAP, maybe we also want to depart from some of the EU regulations in this area, or they might decide that they want different regulations about things like artificial intelligence. That's quite
But then
likely.
the likes of Switzerland, for example, they're in constant debate with the European Union, who are increasingly seeking to say, you can't have your cake and eat it,
Yes.
because especially in the post-Brexit world, because they don't want anyone to think that they can have a deal like Switzerland,
Yes, this is true, absolutely. And I mean, you can see from, to be fair, you can see the EU's point of view. I mean, they don't want to basically provide a free of charge regulatory service that people can opt into and out of on a take your pick basis. I can understand their point of view, quite honestly. They're saying this is a package deal. You either buy the whole lot or bugger off, basically, and go your own way. But I think the the question is that this is, I think, what we will have to do simply because we don't have the state capacity is to do what David Lammy suggests as a short-term measure. But I think what will then start is some pretty serious argument in both parties, actually, in both the Labour Party and the Conservative Party, as to, well, what do we do now? You know, what is the trajectory that we follow after that? Is it to just sail along side the EU like one of those pilot fish that follow sharks around, you know, those little black and white fish that swim alongside sharks and eat the dribbles that fall out of their mouth? Or do we actually think, well, you know, we're actually setting off on a kind of 10-year project of gradually working out what our own independent regulatory regime is? And I think that cuts completely across most political divisions. It's as much a matter of practicalities of what you want to do in government as it is about any kind of highfalutin principles. And I think probably we will choose to merge way for it because in various ways our economy is oriented more towards the world outside Europe. Our trade with the rest of the world is growing, whereas our trade with continental Europe is declining as a proportion of our total trade, for example. And that's going to reflect in the political pressure on governments to maybe start to move away from the European model. So I think in the short term, we're definitely going to do that for simple practical reasons. Simply, we do not have the state capacity at the moment to generate our own regulatory regime. We've allowed it to atrophy during our membership of the EEC and then European Union because we've outsourced all that kind of work to hardworking chaps in Brussels. And we're now having to basically rebuild that kind of state capacity, which we currently don't have. And that's not something you can do overnight. I think that was the point Kemi Badenoch was making.
Yes, I mean, it certainly is fascinating. I mean, what does history tell us, Steve, about the being in this kind of state of flux? It seems to me that, you know, Brexit certainly helped speed up, expedite a realignment, perhaps. But this constant state of churn, you know, it's what it feels like right now. When will things settle down again, do you think?
In the next 5 years, I think
5
they are going to
years.
settle down. I think we're coming out of when these periods of churn go on, and I've lived through one already before in the 1970s. When they're going on, you think, oh my God, this is never going to end. But then actually, quite suddenly, they do become quite stabilised, and you start to see. And I think we're in the next 5 years, they are going to stabilise quite steadily. And part of that stabilisation process is, I think, that the Labour Party is going to be in power, but will be driven by forces within while it's in power in directions that perhaps it doesn't anticipate. And on the other side, the right is going to sort out what it is and what its project is, and we'll have a new stable politics as a result of that. I think that's where we are now, and so I expect politics to become much more stable after the next election, and we'll have a much clearer idea of where the divisions in British politics are after then.
Well, Dr. Steve Davies, thank you very much for your time. No doubt you'll have, I think I can safely predict, that actually the comment section will be a buzzing. But Steve, thank you very much for your time.
My pleasure. Thank you very much, Darren.
Have you got what it takes to be a reasoned presenter? Well, send us a short clip of yourself to join@reasoned.uk and we might be seeing you on this very channel very soon indeed.